Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's live stream where we are focusing on the HDR tool, which is a new addition to Capture One 20. But even though it's just two little sliders or two additional sliders that we've added, the white and the black, it makes a massive difference to your photo editing, which you are going to see today as well. So let's dive straight into it. So I've got a perfect example here from my buddy Randall. This is some ice racing out in Wisconsin, I think it was. And this is great because we've got, two extremes of the tonal range. We've got some dark shadows and we've got some bright highlights as well. So this is a great opportunity to see just what you can do with 4 simple sliders and exposure sliders as well. And really to make your editing much faster and much simpler as well. Whereas previously, without just these 2 additional sliders, these ones which I'm talking about, the whites and the blacks, then it's actually more time consuming and more complicated to get the results you need. So let's have a look. Right, now this photo currently has no adjustments on it as far as I can tell. It's part of a sequence, so let's just check it's reset. Yes, it is. Whoops. Move my Capture One window. So we're going to have a look at a couple of different examples just to see how they behave with the extremes of the editing. So first of all, if I was going to edit this shot, I'd look at it and consider, okay, it's a little bit on the dark side, so I'd lift up the exposure slightly and probably add a bit more contrast in as well. Now straight away, let's bring out the high dynamic range tool, and we'll bring out the levels as well, just so we're all kind of looking in one spot. It's going to make our eyes or jobs a little bit easier. So if we turn on exposure warnings, we can see exposure wise it's not too bad. So we've just got a little bit of burnout on the sign, but I doubt really we're going to be able to recover that. It's a big specular highlight. So what I'm looking for is kind of over the rest of the shot. So it's still a bit muddy in my opinion, so I probably want it not that much, but just a little bit on the brighter side, like so. Let's kind of go around here, something like that. And I'm just going to hit auto on my levels as well. Now for me, what's happening now is that we're kind of losing the detail that's going on in the suit. I want to bring a little bit of that back, and the snow, whilst it's not burning out, I don't think in a few places it's not super bright, just want to kind of see a bit more of the detail within the ice and the snow and so on. Now let's imagine we didn't have our white and black sliders first of all, so we're going to go back a version to Capture One. I could say, well, I could open up the shadows, sorry, that's the highlights, David. I could open up the shadows like so. But you see what it's doing, it's kind of affecting the trees in the background and then all of this guy, so his entire suit. And it's kind of making it look a little bit flat. It's sort of losing that contrast, if you know what I mean, because it's almost there as it is. Now, if we zoom back into him again, let's open up the shadows once more. So that gives you an impression of what's going on. So let's reset that back to 0. But as I said, for me, it's too dramatic. It's getting too flat. So now if we take the blacks and we lift them up, and you see if I push that all the way to 100, see it's much, much more subtle because it's dealing with just those really much, much darker tones. And if we look at the trees in the background, if we pull this around, you see, they're barely budging at all. So the black slider isn't having really any influence on those 3 quarter tones. So if you look at the histogram, so you see that little bump just where my cursor is, and we move the blacks, you can just see it wiggle and creep along a little bit more, for example. If we grab the shadows, then you see it's a much bigger sea change. So if I wanted to edit this nicely, I would probably bring the blacks up to maximum and just have a tiny little bit shadow increase as well, like so. Now without the black slider, what I would have had to do would be to create a mask, open up the blacks a tiny bit as well, so it would be much more time consuming. But juggling sort of between these 2 sliders gives us much more scope and flexibility. Now let's just zoom out a tiny bit. Let's have a look at our brighter areas, so the snow in front. Now if we looked at our exposure warnings, you can see it's It's not overexposed, it's just kind of hanging on to the edge of it, but it would be nice to see a bit more detail in there. So again, going back in time to say capture 1, 12, 11, 10 and so on, if we bring the highlights down, that does a really nice job, and I go all the way down to bring as much or as little detail as you want, for example. Now I wouldn't go that far because I like the high contrast look of this shot. It fits the sport and the dynamic nature and so on and so forth. So going all the way down with the highlight slider for me wouldn't be an end nice result, because if we zoom out, let's zoom out and just edit that as we would, let's just make sure we can see kind of all the way down here as well, then it kind of getting a bit flat. I still want that high contrast look. So instead, if we take the whites down, see, we can just get a little bit of detail back in here. If we turn our exposure warnings back on, that's actually everything is within range now. We've got no exposure warnings except for on the front here, but that's probably a lost cause because it's glancing off the sun. But just by tweaking that white down a little bit, everything is tucked nicely back in range, but we've still got a nice high contrast subject. I could probably afford to put in a little bit of clarity as well and still retain that nice high contrast look. So balancing between these 4 sliders, and of course not forgetting exposure as well, gives you much more power as well. So we're going to do another one in a second because it's slightly different and involves sort of a little bit more technique, and we can really see what's going on with the histogram as well. So looking at a couple of questions, I'm going to go right back to the start, which is a slightly irrelevant question, but it's kind of relevant for what's going to happen tomorrow. So Frank was asking about the demo and how to import images. So tomorrow, our longer form live session, which will be around an hour, is going to be all about managing your catalog. So Frank, you should join up for that. And there's information in the comments about how to find those various things as well. So that was a little sidebar for Frank. There was a couple of other more common questions. So let's find out. How's the weather? Pretty miserable actually, so let's we'll cover that one. Weather here is not great. Okay, so let's have a little scroll down. I did see a question. What's the difference between the methods of clarity? Loris was asking. I did cover that on another session, but briefly it just changes the way the mid-tone contrast acts. Now, to be honest, you want to be on natural most of the time. Punch adds a bit more saturation. Neutral is an old version of natural, and classic is a really old version. So really, juggle between the top 2 is my best advice, for example. And Alan, yes, you could use shadow on a new layer and use opacity to lower it. But the whole point of having additional tools and the additional sliders is to prevent you having to do that additional work as well. Cool, let's have another look at a different example. Well, it's still the same photo series, but it's interesting how it behaves. I think it was, let's have a look at, we're going to look at 2 more actually, because the last one's quite quick. So let's reset this one. Just move our little tool stack over here for a second. Now, once again, this is pretty good out of camera. Nice one, Randall. But I would just bring it up ever so slightly, just a little bit. I'd probably bring up the brightness, which is just going to lift our midtones slightly, because I just want to brighten the midtones but not the snow too much. Now, looking at the highlight here again, it's not out of range, it's kind of just out of range if you like. So let's turn that back off. Now again, if I was to use the highlight slider, then we could get that back, but see how everything's gone a bit duller? And then look at the histogram on the far right hand side. When I pull this, see our big peak here and our little peak here, which is our highlight. So see, if I put my hand on top of the snow here, you see the orange line just lines up on that peak. So that's this highlight hump here. And then this highlight here is probably kind of around in this area. Let's actually stick a picker around sort of that point or something. Okay, so if we play with our highlights, you can see how much the histogram moves there. So at 0, we've got a density of around 208, so on the RGB scale. If I kind of bring it down to bring my snow into line here a bit better, then we're all the way down to 185. So it's kind of made everything a bit flatter, not just in the highlights, but in those 3/4 tones as well. Let's do the same with the whites. So now let's just move those down, and it's not quite as dark. So you can see it's just really focusing on the brighter tones. So once again, if I was to try and bring that snow into line, around here would be something like that. We're down to 189. If I just use the whites to around here, it hasn't moved nearly as much. So really focusing on those top parts. Now, if you remember, I lifted up the brightness a little bit. Now it's still a bit flat for my liking. So what we could do in this case, we could actually go negative with the blacks. So let's focus in on his suit. So we've got nice detail and everything, but again, a little bit flat, I like the high contrast look. So if we went down in this respect, so you see it's just making those shadows deeper, but it's not affecting these lighter areas like on his leg and sort of lower chest here, for example. Whereas if I went with the shadows, you see it's doing those dark shadows and these ones as well. So once again, to maintain a bit of nice contrast, I could crush the blacks, as we say, and bring that down in the opposite sense, like so. So really a ton of flexibility in the kind of look that you want to get as well. Like again, if I wanted to bump up the clarity, I would probably do so a little bit as well and retain all that nice tonal range, but still get a high contrast look as well. Good question from Keith. What does the bottom number in the picker refer to? So that's just our cumulative density, if you like. Trying to think the best way to describe it. So that just gives you, if you imagine a histogram which isn't separated into its 3 channels, here we go, like this one in the Luma curve. So this would tell you the density of that pixel, essentially. So we can see, you know, the change quite clearly, or the difference between those 2 different tools when we use the black slider, white slider, shadow and highlight sliders to make that comparison. Good timely question from Irene. Why do you go negative on the black and not use the contrast slider in the exposure menu? Well, remember, the contrast slider will also affect your highlights. So this is a way of separating that as well. So if we bring up contrast, for example, so let's reset black. If I push the contrast up, it's going to probably make this area brighter. So if I do that, notice that the snow at the front here has also got lighter. Now it might have improved what's going on here in the suit to some extent, but it's also making everything else brighter. So if I just bring the blacks down, it's kind of a way of adding contrast, but I'm retaining my highlights as well. Now I might do a little combination of the 2, so I don't object to that getting a bit brighter, but remember I just kind of rescued it with the whites as well. So it's kind of a balancing act between all those different sliders as well. Okay, let's have a look at the final one. Which one was I playing with earlier? I think it was with this one actually. Let's have a look. Let's see, let's just reset this one. Let's just get rid of my picker for the minute. Go away. There we go. So similar kind of thing. Now this one is backlit, of course, so we've got the sun coming in from behind. You can see the shadows here. It's putting these guys in quite deep shadows, for example, but we still got some detail in the sleeves and so on. So really looking at this shot, what do I want to do? Exposure wise, it's probably fine. If we look at the levels, see everything is within range. We're not losing any shadow detail. We're not losing any highlight detail. So it's kind of okay as it is. But what I would think is that it's maybe a little bit too harsh. So I want to see just a bit more detail in here. So that would be a case of just, see if I pull up the blacks dramatically, or just back and forth, you can see really how targeted it is just to those darker areas. And again, if we grab our shadows, so if we look at, say, around the fender here, for example, and the back, if we look at the shadows, you see how it affects those. If we look at the blacks, you see it's really only those darkest points again. So really good separation between those tones as well. So again, if I wanted to adjust this, I would just open up the blacks a little touch, like so, around there. And then for the whites, again, I want the high contrast look, but I might just back them off just a tiny touch as well. And that's almost editing over for that shot. I might bring up the brightness just a little bit just for the background. You see that's very much just targeting the midtones. So that's a good little tweak like so. And saturation is fine, and maybe a touch of contrast as well. So really a good juggling act between all those different sliders too. Good question from Nicholas, which I've just seen. The difference between exposure and brightness. Again, all these sliders kind of interplay with each other as well, so they're quite interesting to, you know, take a shot like this and just play around with them, find something high contrast. But essentially the difference between exposure and brightness is exposure is really the best analogy to make is, just grab a camera. The best analogy to make is that if you're adjusting exposure, it's the same as, you know, playing with exposure compensation on the camera itself. So it's raising everything by, you know, pretty much an almost linear amount. So if I was to come up, put the camera down. If I was to come up on exposure, let's reset brightness and contrast. If I was to come up on exposure, it's going to brighten the midtone, shadows, highlights, everything, if you like. So you see if we wiggle the exposure back and forth, the houses in the background are getting brighter, the snow in the foreground's getting brighter, and the black jackets are getting brighter as well. So everything is kind of being lifted. Now if we pull up brightness, so you see it's a little bit more subtle. Notice that these areas at the front don't change as much at all. So if we bring brightness up, we're essentially doing this kind of thing. A little bit more technical than that, but we're kind of making the midtones brighter as if we were using a curve. So again, when you look at the image, you're kind of analyzing it in your head, or at least that's how I do it, and think about all the tonal ranges and what needs to be a bit brighter. I mean, we can see a dip here, for example. There's really nothing going much on the midtone, but it's very bright here, and we've also got stuff going on the shadows. So if we pull around with brightness, it's kind of bunching everything to the right and the left and so on. If we pull exposure, you can see it's much more dramatic as well. So you see how that curve drops off as well, whereas with brightness, it's not quite as much. So it's subtle, but it's definitely there. So brightness is a really useful tool to use as well. What is Kelly asking? Kelly says, if you pull the black slider all the way down, but you need more from that slider, could you get more out of it? Yes, that's actually a good question, actually. So if we did blacks all the way to the right, or all the way to the left, doesn't matter, whatever we're going to do. Let's do it this way, and then we did a new filled layer, for example, then we could do the same again. So that would just give you effectively 200 blacks as opposed to just 100 blacks. So just add a new layer, call it more or less or whatever, black in this case, and then you can multiply that effect. So that's actually a really good question, Kelly. Well done. Let's delete that layer, but that could be applicable actually for any slider. Normally the extremes of a slider is enough, but sometimes if you wanted a little bit more, especially on clarity, if you have a really flat shot, then you can double up quite nicely as well. That's also a good, let's just move that down a bit, also a good question based on today's learnings. So should not all the exposure settings be done before using the high dynamic range tool, or does it not matter? It's a combination really, because it's all interplaying with the tonal range. I mean, before all these sliders like highlight, shadows, whites, blacks, brightness and so on, if you just had exposure to deal with as a kind of compensation, then everything else that you would have to do would rely on kind of working with curves or local adjustments. So it's a lot more complex or time consuming. Here the interplay of those sliders is really the key thing. So don't feel that you need to do this and then this. in terms of high dynamic range, you can always kind of juggle back and forth. There's on our Learning Hub, there's a tutorial I made called Exposure and Contrast, and it just goes through all the different ways of changing exposure and contrast and describes these tools as well. So that's another thing you can watch as well. But it's pretty much a repeat of what we were talking about here as well. Last couple of questions, and I have a couple of messages which I need to give out to you as well. But that's thanks for that question. That was a good one. Harold says, doubling up is the best trick I learned today. Can't believe I didn't realise that. I mean, most of the time you don't need to, but it's very handy if you do run out of steam on a slider or double up colour edits or all that kind of stuff. It's very possible as well. There's the exposure and contrast. I love that a colon and a / makes the unhappy smiley in this engine, but he's not unhappy. That's the tutorial we were talking about. Let's have a look. Yeah, good point from Travis. I use the layer tool to add double highlight reduction, usually in a bright sky. Works great as well. Simon was asking, I have a fantastic knowledge of Capture One. Thank you. What is my background? Hope I'm not being too nosy. Not at all. All of you could have the same knowledge as me if you spend 8 years using it and using it every day. So I have a huge benefit in that respect, that I'm kind of forced to use it, and it's my daily work to use it. But I've always worked in photography. I'm an ex-failed photographer, also ex-darkroom printer as well, which was actually a good basis for learning a lot of this stuff, because it does intermingle nicely as well. So my first photographic job was when I was 16, I think, working in a camera shop. So it's pretty much stemmed from there, really, but old enough to remember film and darkrooms and all that kind of stuff as well. So hope that wasn't totally boring for everyone else. Good question to finish off from Jerry. What does moving the top white marker to the left of the levels tool to reduce the white burnouts do? Well, it's probably slightly cruder and relates to really how kind of the auto levels would work as well. So what you're doing when you move these points in, I'm just going to move them in drastically. What you're asking Capture One to do is to take this point and remap it to this point. So if we had a much flatter image with kind of no tonal range, which we probably don't on any of these shots, let's try this one. So that's slightly better. So if we did this and this, we're saying to Capture One, take the end of that histogram, 2, 4, 6 and 8, and stretch it to the numbers at the top. So then that would give us, if you watch this histogram, as we pull that in, that histogram spreads out, giving you the correct tonal range. If we bring this in, it just limits the spread. So in some ways it can help reduce burnouts and so on, but the slider adjustments for highlights and whites kind of have some sophisticated algorithms behind them to, you know, bring back details and all that kind of stuff. So again, it's a slightly different effect. So look, if I bring this slider across and we look at the snow, you see how it's kind of flat and grey. So it's just kind of changing the density. If we bring the highlights down, you see it's more sophisticated in that it's kind of working the photo a bit more as well, and that we get, and that we get some details back as well. But the same for, if we look at this, it's not quite the same. The main reason for having these points here is if you're going to print and you want to leave some kind of dot, if you like, in the shadows and highlights, there's a case for using it. But generally, if you've edited well, then you don't necessarily need to use that. All right, last few points I need to talk to you about. So as I said at the start, next live session, long form, is tomorrow. So that's going to be an hour, which we're put out in the afternoon. It's essentially our webinar, which we do for people who sign up, but we broadcast it live as well. There's links in the description, so you know where to find that as well. Last chance for promotion. So the offer ends on the 30th of April, which is tomorrow, I believe. Checks watch. So that's 25% off new licenses, 30% off upgrades. And most importantly, Tell us in the comments what you'd like to see in future live sessions, because I'm going to run out of ideas soon, that's for sure. We've got, you know, a good program coming up. We've got Friday with Paul Reiffer, one of our ambassadors. He's going to edit some of his shots. He's been doing live edits too on shots people have sent in. So that's coming up Friday. But after that, we've got a few other things planned. But then it would be nice to hear from you guys and girls what you would like to see in the future as well. Anything you struggle with, which tools do you want to see showcased, any guests that you like the sound of in our ambassador lineup, and so on. So please let us know in the comments what you would like to see as well. Nice one. Okay, thanks very much again for joining today. I hope that was useful. As I said, don't disregard two little sliders called white and black. They're actually very powerful and can save you a lot of time, because interplaying with highlight, shadows, white, black, exposure, contrast, brightness and clarity, there's a whole bunch you can do with all those various different sliders that will save you time and prevent you from perhaps having to do more extensive layering and all that kind of stuff. So just because it's a slider doesn't mean it's dumb. Very powerful. Get to grips with it. Speed up your editing. Great. Thanks again, and see you all tomorrow, hopefully, and Friday, and next week as well. Have a great day. See you. Bye.